For Kew.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Appropriation Bills 2024. And from the outset, from looking at the state of the budget, the state of Victoria's finances, it's very clear that this is a culmination of 10 years of Labor. 10 years of Labor budgets, of blowouts, of waste, of reckless spending and, of course, of record taxes. And what do Victorians have to show for the past 10 years? Record debt, cuts across education and health, delays to projects and increasingly declining services right across the state.
Record wait list.
And what's very, very clear is that Labor cannot manage money, it cannot manage major projects, and Victorians are paying the price.
Order.
Thank you, Speaker.
Member for Wendouree, you're
Now,
not in your seat. You can leave the chamber for half an hour.
the member for Ripon doesn't have to take my word for it. The Age itself called this budget a bad news budget, featuring soaring debt, stalled major project and abandoned promises. And that sums up the 10th Labor budget in which we have seen once again debt soar, taxes rise and decline in services for Victorians. Now, let's look at the facts across this budget, in black and white in the budget papers. Victoria's net debt has increased from $21.8 billion in 2014 to a projected $187.8 billion by 2028. The total tax revenue has increased from $17.8 billion in 2014 to a projected $45 billion over the same period. And interest repayments on Victoria's record debt will reach $26 million a day by 2028. Now, this budget lays bare the consequences of Labor's financial mismanagement, with hundreds of cuts to critical services at a time Victorians can least afford it. There have been cuts to education, cuts to health and to housing services, infrastructure and major projects have been delayed. Wellbeing programs in schools have been cut, and election promises for much-needed school upgrades have been broken.
10 pages.
Victorian hospitals, many of which are already on the brink and operating in deficit, and we've seen these hospitals come to the government and ask for a bailout, will be forced to do more with less. Speaker, this government claims to govern for all Victorians, but they have deliberately ignored the electorate of Kew in their state of budget. And our community deserves our fair share. Our government schools are desperately in need of upgrades. Local transport infrastructure needs updating and the accessibility of public transport needs improving. And I've consistently called for much-needed upgrades to Kew's local schools in this place, for Kew East Primary, for Balwyn Primary, for Canterbury Girls Secondary College, for Kew High School, for Chatham Primary. But nothing again from this government in this budget. And sadly, just a few days of interest payments under this government could fully fund these much-needed upgrades in the schools in Kew. Speaker, if we turn to debt and deficits under the Labor government over the past 10 years, and we've seen economic conditions in Victoria continue to deteriorate, with government debt only adding to inflationary pressures in this state. Now, net debt is forecast to reach $188 billion by 2028, which is a blowout of $10 billion from last year's forecasts. That's nearly $47 million added every day since the last budget. $47 million added to our debt bill since the last budget. That comes down to a staggering $67,000 for every Victorian household. Every Victorian household in this state carries $67,000 worth of that record debt. And this year's deficit has worsened by $1 billion since the end of financial year update. Now, this is despite the fact the Treasurer received a $3.7 billion GST windfall. We have seen the deficit deepen. Now, on top of the $188 billion net debt figure, the budget shows that Victorian government agencies, the VMIA, WorkCover, TCV, TAC, VFMC and the state trustees will be $68 billion in debt by 2028 and are projected to fall into negative net financial worth by 2026. The state's public non-financial corporations, the water corps, the ports, the housing corps, will be $37 billion in debt by 2028 and have accumulated deficits of $65 billion, paying $1.4 billion in interest. So whether it's the state's public financial corporations or non-financial corporations, their accumulated debt is greater than when the Coalition left office in 2014. This deterioration comes despite these agencies levying higher fees on Victorians, including a 43% increase in domestic building insurance last year and a 42% average increase in WorkCover premiums in May last year. Now, I think every member of this side of the House will say they are yet to meet a small business that only paid a 42% increase in WorkCover premiums. I've heard 60, 70, 80, 90% increase on small businesses at a time they can least afford it, at a time they're being hit with higher taxes and higher electricity bills. And this level of debt right across Victoria's agencies is why the ratings agencies S&P expects Victoria's gross debt to reach nearly $250 billion in the coming years, with interest on Victoria's soaring debt to reach over $14 billion per year. What is absolutely clear, Speaker, is that Labor can't manage the books, they can't manage their agencies, and Victorians are paying the price through higher premiums. Now, those opposite like to blame COVID for the state's record debt, but we know that COVID-related debt only makes up 17% of the state's debt. And this year, the Treasurer added a fifth step to his COVID debt repayment plan. Net debt to GSP is the new measure that the Treasurer is pointing to. Let's take a look at those figures. When Labor took office in 2014, net debt as a percentage of GSP was sitting at about 5%. In 2024-25, it will be 24.4%, climbing to 25.2% in 2026-27. And in what the Treasurer is lauding as his debt repayment plan working, net debt as a proportion of GSP will fall to 25.1% in 2028, a meagre 0.1% decrease. Now, that's cold comfort to Victorian taxpayers who will be paying $9.4 billion in interest in 2028, or $26 million a day. Imagine what that money could fund. As I said, it could fully fund the upgrades to many schools across the state in just a couple of days. And if that is the government's and the Treasurer's answer to our soaring debt, then sadly, I think we've only started to see the cuts and delays from this government. And just today, we heard from the Treasurer who wanted to travel back to the 1980s in question time. Now, let's just revisit net debt as a percentage of GSP when it peaked at 16% in 1993 under the Kane-Kerner recession. His financial management makes that Kane-Kerner debt levels look manageable. Victoria's growing debt has serious consequences, Speaker. Not only is it intergenerational burden, with generations to come forced to pay down this debt through higher taxes and poorer services, but it means real-time cuts, delays and broken promises in last week's budget. And let's turn to some of those broken promises and cuts and delays. Looking to education, we've seen funding for several important education services, including vital services to support student health and wellbeing, cut. A $34 million cut to wellbeing at schools. It also significantly delays the rollout of desperately needed early childhood education and care centres, and we'll see hundreds of hours missed for children through their 4-year-old kinder program. We're also seeing a $75 million cut to early childhood sector supports and regulations. And then, of course, as we've heard others speak to today, there is the unfunded school project upgrades in this budget. This budget lays bare the broken promises to dozens of schools across this state, 29 capital upgrades that were not funded in this budget. And while Labor promises to govern for every Victorian, but when you look at an analysis of both the funding commitments as well as the funding delivery to schools by electorate, it shows once again that politics trumps need time and time again. And of the schools Labor have made commitments to in 2022, 70% are in Labor seats and only 26% are in coalition seats. And 80% of those schools are in Labor seats have received funding, while only 41% of coalition seats have received funding. Now, those opposite like to point to the fact that they have more seats in this place, but that does not equate to the funding that has flowed right across to these electorates. And you cannot claim to govern for all Victorians and then funnel money to buy votes at an election. If we turn to Victoria's health system, a system that is already at crisis points where ambulance wait times have blown out, we're seeing patients left stranded outside crowded emergency departments, we're seeing cuts to the health system right across the board, and we're seeing the Health Minister point to amalgamations, reducing services for Victorians that need it most. We've seen public health have a $207 million cut, ambulance services a $20 million cut, aged and home care $43 million cut, IVF public services $42 million cuts. And then, of course, when it comes to capital investment, we've seen health infrastructure projects delayed and cancelled. Delays to the establishment of 10 new community hospitals, with 3 sites cut entirely. We've seen the Ardern Health Precinct cancelled, spruiked by this government as the biggest hospital project in Australia's history on the eve of the 2022 election. Yet that has been cut, that has been cancelled because of the misleading advice this government has not provided to Victorians. Now, the budget papers also revealed that the number of patients admitted from the planned servicing waiting list will be reduced from their own target of 240,000 in 2022-23 to 200,000 in 2024-25. Now, this reduction comes despite more than a 40% increase in Victoria's urgent Category 1 servicing wait list across March 2024 quarter, as the total number of Victorians waiting for elective surgery remains well above the 60,000. If we turn to the 75% cut to the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, while this government has prioritised a $4 million scoreboard in Geelong, once again demonstrates that this government have their priorities all wrong. When we look at where the spending is going, the reckless spending by this government, $40 billion in waste and cost blowouts on infrastructure projects. The North East Link, a $21.1 billion blowout under this government. In one day last year, the Premier alone announced a $10 billion blowout on that project. The Westgate Tunnel, a $4.7 billion blowout. The Metro Tunnel, a $4 billion blowout. And now we know that the airport rail link is delayed at least 4 years, costing Victorians, I might add, $67 million just to demobilise that project in the meantime. And all while these projects blow out, are delayed because of the mismanagement of this government, we're of course seeing the prioritisation of their pet project, the Suburban Rail Loop. The Suburban Rail Loop, which has a TBC next to it in terms of funding in the budget, once again not being upfront and transparent with the Victorian people about the true cost of their mismanagement. We've seen taxes rise in this budget once again, after we saw last year taxes on business, on rents, on schools and education. And of course, we see the public service wage bill blow out time and time again. We've seen over the past 10 years, the Labor government once again cooked the books in terms of how much the public sector wage bill is going to cost, missing that target every single time. Speaker, this is a culmination of 10 years of Labor, a culmination of reckless spending and complete disregard for taxpayers' money. It's a culmination of waste and mismanagement. Labor cannot manage money, they cannot manage projects, and Victorians are dearly paying the price.
Hear, hear.
Member for Tarneit.